Hey, Grandpa, I think you took a wrong turn. The voice belonged to Sergeant Collins, a hotshot sniper with more confidence than common sense. He pointed at the elderly man's simple bolt-action rifle. The antique gun show is probably next weekend. The voice was sharp, dripping with the kind of arrogance that only comes from being the best shot in the battalion and knowing it. Robert Hayes didn't look up from his shooting kit. He was 84 years old, and the simple act of organizing his ammunition deserved more of his attention than the group of elite Marines standing around the 200-yard firing line. He could feel their presence, the sheer physical density of their egos filling the desert air. They were the cream of the crop, carved from precision and modern technology, wearing their ghillie suits like badges of honor. The one who had spoken, Sergeant Collins, with his perfectly zeroed rifle and eyes that missed nothing about equipment but everything about experience, leaned against the concrete barrier. His scope was worth more than most people's cars, his shooting data meticulously logged in a high-tech tablet. "I'm talking to you, old man." The target, he gestured with his chin toward Robert's weathered wooden rifle stock, was set at an impossible distance for civilian equipment. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and even their advanced ballistic computers were struggling to calculate firing solutions. "What about it?" Robert's voice was gravelly, a low rumble that seemed to cost him little effort. He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes pale gray and steady, holding a calm stillness that seemed to unnerve the cocky Marine. The second sniper, Corporal Martinez, quieter but equally dismissive, nudged Collins. "Jake, leave the old-timer alone. Range safety will handle it." Collins ignored him. "I'm just curious what kind of shooting you think you're going to do with that museum piece. Some kind of deer hunting? Maybe shooting tin cans in your backyard?" He smirked. "What's the effective range on that thing? 200 yards? The range, a sprawling expanse of desert scrub and precisely measured distances carved out of Camp Pendleton, had been humming with the quiet intensity of precision shooting. Now a pocket of silence was expanding from Robert's bench. The range safety officer and other shooters, military contractors and Marines who had seen plenty of civilian visitors, shot nervous glances at the weathered old man with the ancient rifle. Robert took a slow sip from his thermos of coffee. He placed it down with a steady hand. It reaches, Collins mimicked, drawing the words out mockingly. "Reaches what? The target?" At this distance, the condescension was thick enough to cut. He was testing him, prodding him, enjoying what he perceived as complete technical superiority. He and his team were the tip of the spear, the most precise shooters the Corps had ever produced. This old man was just another curious civilian who had wandered onto their range. "Something like that," Robert said, his eyes drifting toward the distant target that shimmered in the heat waves. This infuriated Collins. He expected deference or at least acknowledgement of his expertise. He was getting nothing but calm indifference. "You know, we don't appreciate civilians thinking they can just show up here and play soldier. This is serious business. Lives depend on the skills we're developing here." He pointed a thick finger at Robert's rifle again. "That antique was probably state-of-the-art when your grandfather was young. We're using precision instruments here, computer-calculated firing solutions, laser rangefinders, ballistic software. It's a little more complex than Kentucky windage and prayer." Corporal Martinez finally spoke up, his voice cautious. "He's not bothering anyone, Sarge." Command cleared him for the range. "No," Collins snapped, his focus locked on Robert. "I want to know. I want to hear about the good old days when real men used iron sights and guts. What's your story, Pops? Korean War? Vietnam? You probably never shot at anything further than a football field." Robert's gaze returned from the target and settled on Collins' face. It wasn't a challenging look, it was a look of profound soul-deep patience, as if he were seeing not just this arrogant young Marine, but a long line of them stretching back through time. "I've done some shooting," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where it counted." Collins laughed, a harsh barking sound.
Where it counted.
"That's it? That's your war story?" He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "I think you're full of it, old man. I think you spent your war washing dishes and you brought that pawn shop special out here to impress the young Marines." The disrespect was palpable now. It hung in the air, thick and sour. The range safety officer had stopped his equipment checks. The other shooters had put down their rifles to watch. The quiet professionalism of the firing line had died completely. Everyone was listening. Collins straightened up, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He'd won. He'd exposed the old man's pretensions, even if he hadn't gotten the dramatic reaction he wanted. He turned to Martinez. See, just another wannabe living in the past. As he spoke, he made his final critical mistake. He reached out and dismissively tapped the worn wooden stock of Robert's rifle. The touch was casual, almost playful, but for Robert, it was like a lightning strike. The scent of desert sage and gun oil vanished, replaced in an instant by the thick, humid smell of jungle rot and cordite. The distant crack of rifle fire became the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors and the sharp whistle of incoming mortars. He wasn't on a California range anymore. Kid Shees wasn't on a California range anymore. He was lying in tall grass on a hill overlooking a valley in a country that didn't exist on any official maps. A young voice crackled in his earpiece, tight with fear. Ghost 1. We've got movement in the tree line. Multiple targets. Range unknown. He remembered his response. Calm and deadly. Copy. Overwatch. I have eyes on. Stand by. The crosshairs of his scope, the same scope now mounted on the rifle Collins had just touched, settled on a figure nearly 2 miles away, an impossible shot through shifting wind and jungle humidity, but not impossible for him. He squeezed the trigger. The memory ended with the distant thud of impact and the satisfied voice of his spotter. Target down. Hell of a shot, Ghost. The rifle wasn't just a tool, it was a witness to things that had never happened, in places that had never existed, for missions that were still classified 5 decades later. He blinked, and the desert returned. Collins' finger was still resting on the wooden stock. Robert slowly pulled his rifle back, his expression unchanged. But something inside him had shifted. The placid surface remained, but beneath it, an ancient precision had awakened. While Collins was posturing, enjoying his performance for the silent range, Master Gunnery Sergeant Williams was watching from the range tower. He had been observing the confrontation with growing unease. Not because of Collins' attitude, he'd seen plenty of arrogant young snipers, but because of the old man's reaction, or rather his complete lack of one. Williams had been in the Corps for 28 years. He'd seen every type of shooter, every kind of veteran, every species of range wannabe, but this old man had something different. The way he handled his rifle, the economy of his movements, the 1,000-yard stare that seemed to see through time itself. He slipped into the range control room. Closing the door softly, he pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Camp Pendleton Historical Archives. It was a long shot, but something about the old man's rifle nagged at him. That scope, that stock configuration, he'd seen it in old photographs. The phone rang twice before a professional voice answered. Pendleton Archives, Captain Morrison speaking. Captain, this is Master Guns Williams out at range 400. I need you to run a check on something unusual. We've got a civilian on the range, elderly gentleman with what looks like a Vietnam-era precision rifle. Custom job, woodstock, distinctive scope, mounting. Williams, is this about a historical verification? I'm pretty backed up with. Sir, Williams interrupted, his voice dropping lower. The rifle looks familiar, like something I've seen in classified photos from the archives. And the man carrying it, he paused. He handles it like someone who's used it professionally. There was a pause on the other end. What's the shooter's name? That's what I'm hoping you can help me with. Elderly, maybe mid-80s, gray hair, moves like former military but no obvious unit identifiers. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Captain Morrison spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Master Guns, I need you to do me a favor. Can you get close enough to read any markings on that rifle? Serial numbers, unit markings, anything? I can try, sir. Do it. And Williams, don't let that man leave the range. If that rifle is what I think it is, we need to make some calls. The line went dead. Back on the firing line, Collins had reached his breaking point. The old man's silent refusal to be impressed or intimidated had become a personal insult. His professional reputation, his identity as an elite marksman, was being challenged by an octogenarian with a museum piece. All right, Pops, I've had enough of this strong, silent act, he said, his voice turning ugly. He grabbed Robert's upper arm, his grip firm and threatening. Time for you to pack up your antique, and head back to the retirement home. You're embarrassing yourself. He was threatening to physically remove an 84-year-old man from a public range. A collective intake of breath went through the watching shooters. Martinez grabbed his partner's shoulder. Collins, what the hell are you doing? But Collins was beyond reason. He started to pull Robert from his shooting position. It was then that the sound reached them. It wasn't the familiar rumble of range traffic. It was something deeper, more urgent, the roar of multiple vehicles moving at high speed, their engines pushed to the limit, heads turned toward the access road. 3 black military SUVs and a command Humvee had appeared over the ridge, throwing up clouds of dust as they raced toward the firing line. They weren't just driving, they were responding to an emergency. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the confrontation, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. Men in crisp service uniforms emerged, with a disciplined urgency that made even the elite snipers look like amateurs in comparison. Collins and Martinez froze. They recognized the vehicles, the protocol, the barely controlled intensity of the response. Their blood ran cold. The arrogance and bluster drained from Collins' face, replaced by sickly pale confusion and the first icy tendrils of pure terror. Out of the lead SUV stepped Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, the commanding general of the entire West Coast Marine Corps Training Command. Our single star gleamed in the desert sun, but it was her expression that commanded attention. Hold, controlled fury barely held in check. She didn't look at the stunned Marines. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the scene until they found the elderly man still being gripped by Collins' hand. She walked directly toward them, her stride powerful and uncompromising. The entire range had fallen utterly silent. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on gravel and the whistle of desert wind. Collins stood frozen, his hand still on Robert's arm, his mind unable to process what was happening. General Hayes stopped directly in front of them. She looked at Collins' hand on Robert's arm, and the expression in her eyes was so cold that Collins snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. Then, General Hayes did something that no one on that range could have ever predicted. She brought her heels together with a sharp crack, her back ramrod straight in the middle of the dusty firing range. Surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and desert sage, the commanding general of Marine Corps training on the West Coast snapped to the sharpest, most respectful salute Collins had ever witnessed. It was not the perfunctory salute given to a superior officer. It was a salute of profound, almost reverent respect, the kind a warrior gives to a living legend. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent range. "Sir, it is an honor. I apologize for the conduct of my Marines. They don't understand who they're addressing." She held the salute, waiting. Robert slowly, gracefully rose from his shooting bench. He was not as tall as he once was, but he stood with a straightness that defied his years. He gave a slight, acknowledging nod. Only then did the general drop her salute. She turned to face Collins, and the warmth in her eyes was replaced by glacial ice. "Sergeant," she began, her voice dangerously quiet. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Collins, pale and trembling, could only stammer, "No, ma'am. He's a civilian, ma'am." "A civilian?" The general let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sergeant, you and your men are standing on ground you've never earned, breathing air you haven't paid for, in the presence of a man who wrote the book on precision shooting that you pretend to have mastered." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, her gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd of shooters and range personnel. "This is not just a civilian. This is Robert Hayes, call sign Ghost One. For those of you too young or too ignorant to know the name, let me educate you." She turned toward the distant target, barely visible in the heat shimmer. "That target at 1,200 yards that you've been missing all morning? Mr. Hayes holds the record for the longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history. A shot he made in 1968 at 2,847 yards, in a crosswind, in the rain, with the same rifle your sergeant just called a museum piece." A wave of shock rippled through the range. Collins looked like he had been physically struck. "The mission was so classified," the general continued, "that Mr. Hayes' service record was sealed for 40 years. He served with Military Assistance Command Studies and Observations Group. MAC VSOG. If you don't know what that means, you don't deserve to wear that uniform." She took a step closer to Collins, her voice dropping even further. He spent 3 years in places that don't exist on any map, doing things that never happened with a rifle that was never issued. He has 47 confirmed kills, each one at over 1,000 yards, each one saving American lives. The general looked around the range, her gaze settling on each stunned face. The scope on his rifle?
He made the modifications himself in a jungle firebase with a file and a soldering iron.
The stock? Hand-fitted to his exact measurements. That rifle has been with him for 55 years, and it has never missed when it mattered. She let that sink in. The weight of her words settled over the range like a physical force. "You wear the uniform of the United States Marine Corps," she said to Collins. "That uniform represents precision, professionalism, and respect for those who came before. Today you forgot what precision looks like. You forgot what professionalism means. You forgot to respect your elders, especially one who earned that respect in blood." She looked Collins up and down with utter contempt. "My office. Tomorrow, 0800.
Woo!
Bring your squadron commander. Be prepared to explain to me why you deserve to continue wearing the eagle, globe, and anchor." She had just threatened to end his Marine Corps career. As Collins stood there broken and humiliated, Robert Hayes finally spoke. He looked not at the general, but at the pale, shattered faces of the young Marines around him. His voice was soft, devoid of anger or triumph. "The rifle doesn't make the marksman," he said, his gray eyes holding theirs steadily. "The marksman makes the rifle accurate." All this, he gestured vaguely, at the high-tech equipment scattered around the range. The computers, the ballistic calculators, the laser rangefinders, they help, but they can't replace what's in here. He tapped his temple with a weathered finger. "And they can't replace the hours of practice, the understanding of wind and weather, and the discipline to make the shot count when lives are on the line." With that, he looked at General Hayes. "Ma'am, would you like to see what the old rifle can do?" The general smiled, the first genuine expression anyone had seen from her. "It would be my honor, Mr. Hayes." As Robert settled back into his shooting position, a final memory bloomed in his mind, not of Vietnam, but of a quiet moment decades later. A much younger Patricia Hayes, then a captain, standing in his gunsmithing shop as he worked on her personal rifle. She had sought him out, one of the few people who knew his real story. "Why do you still work on rifles?" she had asked. "After everything you've seen." He had looked up from his workbench, his hands steady despite his age. "Because precision matters, Captain, in war and in peace. And because every rifle I touch might be the one that brings someone home safe." Now, 55 years after his first impossible shot, Robert Hayes settled behind his rifle one more time. The target at 1,200 yards wavered in the heat, but his crosshairs found it immediately. He didn't need computers or calculations. He read the wind in the movement of dust, felt the humidity in the air, adjusted for the slight crosswind that the Marines' equipment couldn't detect. The rifle cracked once, a sharp, clean sound that seemed to hang in the desert air for an eternity. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the range safety officer's voice crackled over the radio. Dead center, perfect bullseye. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the watching Marines. Not just Collins' team, but every shooter on the range. It was a sound of pure respect, the acknowledgement of mastery they had just witnessed. General Hayes just shook her head in admiration. She then turned to Collins, her expression cold again. "Sergeant, you just witnessed something that will probably never happen again in your lifetime. A master showing you how it's really done. I suggest you remember this moment." The fallout from the incident was swift and comprehensive. General Hayes didn't just discipline Collins and his team. She used the incident to address a systemic problem. Young Marines who had become so dependent on technology that they had forgotten the fundamentals of their craft. Within a month, she instituted a new training block called Old School Precision. Every sniper candidate would spend a week learning to shoot with iron sights, to read wind without instruments, and to understand the principles that Robert Hayes had mastered decades before their equipment was even invented. Collins was not discharged from the Corps, but his career as a sniper was over. He was reassigned to training duties, where his job became teaching young Marines about respect for their elders and the fundamentals of marksmanship. For the next 2 years, he had to stand before each new class and tell the story of the day he disrespected a legend. Robert Hayes was invited to become the program's primary instructor, a position he accepted with quiet dignity. 3 days a week he could be found on the range, patiently teaching young Marines the skills that couldn't be programmed into a computer. About 6 months later, Collins encountered Robert at a local sporting goods store. The old man was examining a selection of rifle scopes, moving among them with the practiced eye of someone who understood precision optics better than the store employees. Collins approached hesitantly. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I wanted to apologize again for my behavior that day. There's no excuse for what I said or did." Robert looked up from the scopes, studying Collins' face for a moment. He saw genuine remorse there, the humility that had been beaten into him by months of consequences. "Son," Robert said quietly, "the important thing isn't that you made a mistake. All the important thing is what you learned from it." He held up one of the scopes, examining its clarity. "Pride is like poor optics. It distorts everything you're trying to see clearly. Once you understand that, you can start seeing things as they really are." He gave Collins a small nod, then turned back to his examination of the equipment. The conversation, for him, was already over. He had said what needed to be said. Collins walked away knowing that he had been given something rarer than forgiveness. He had been given a lesson in dignity by a man who had earned the right to teach it. The range at Camp Pendleton still echoes with the crack of Robert Hayes' rifle, and his story has become legend among Marine snipers. They call it the day Ghost One returned, and it serves as a reminder that mastery isn't about the equipment you carry, it's about the skill you've earned and the respect you show to those who earned it before you. If you were moved by Robert Hayes' story of quiet mastery and earned respect, please like this video, subscribe to Veterans Past Stories for more stories, and share it with someone who understands the value of true skill over flashy technology. We'll see you in the next one.